For our presenter for this session, we have Jeff Nokes, who is in the history department, but he does teacher education. He's pretty much been running our teacher education program for the last 5 or 6 years. He just got CFS, so we're all very happy. But for his research, he studies how students learn in their disciplines, especially literacy in their disciplines. And so most of his research deals with high school students, or even like middle school and elementary school students. But a lot of these things, he's going to show you how they really do apply to our students as well. Probably a lot of things that you haven't thought of before, the kinds of things you have to think about when you're teaching new material to students. So I'll go ahead and talk.
So I hope you find this relevant for you. Like my research is mostly with younger kids, but last year, I was working with a bunch of sixth grade students doing some literacy lessons with them, how to read like a historian. And I decided, I've been working with them all year long, and I decided one of the activities I developed for them, I thought would work pretty well for my 201 class, which is a world civilizations class here on campus. And so I used the exact same lesson with my students here that I used with sixth graders. And the sixth graders that I've been working with through the year did a lot better in their analysis of the documents than my college students did here that I hadn't been working with in quite the same way. So I know that there are some needs for our students here to teach them how to read more like experts within the discipline. So that's kind of what the focus is going to be. I'm going to look at these 6 ideas. So we'll talk about this idea of discourse community, and then epistemic stance, and disciplinary text, disciplinary literacies, cognitive apprenticeships, and then explicit strategy instruction. And I'll use history as the example for most of what I talk about. So it'll be up to you a little bit to apply it to your disciplines. And hopefully you'll be able to figure out some ways to do that. And it's a small enough group that feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we're moving. But I'm going to go at a pretty quick pace through these first couple of ideas, and then we'll do a little more interaction after. But feel free to slow me down if you want to talk more about one of the things that I mentioned. So this first idea I want to talk to you about is a discourse community. So discourse community is a group of people who share common language norms, values, patterns, beliefs, or practices as a consequence of their ongoing communication and identification with each other. So probably, if you're LDS, when you go to church, you feel really at home with the people that are there. You speak the same language, so to speak, as they do. Even if you go to a different country where they're speaking a different language, you still probably feel somewhat at home because you can relate to the values and practices and norms and beliefs of that discourse community. If you were to go to a skate park, you probably would not feel nearly as comfortable there because you don't speak the language or the value, you don't have the same values or norms or beliefs of the people that are there, unless you're Don Harold. But the history department chair, I think he's a skater. But the rest of us, we would feel out of place here. And so there is this thing about discourse community. Everybody has a native discourse community where they feel most at ease. And for most of us, it's at home. And this is where we really settle into a discourse community. And what the research has shown is that at schools, and I assume that it's the same thing here, that the closer that we can make the school community feel to students' discourse community, native discourse community, where they're from, then the more successful they'll be. And definitely we shouldn't do anything to denigrate a native discourse community, which can sometimes happen as we're talking about people's background. So this brings us to this point that historians are a discourse community. Geographers form a discourse community. And sociologists and political scientists and anthropologists and archaeologists, each of those are a discourse community with unique language norms, values, beliefs, practices. And as students enter our classrooms, they probably don't feel really comfortable with that discourse community. So and to me, helping them read like a historian or think like a historian is part of introducing them and welcoming them into discourse community. Discourse communities have their own way of reading, too. So what happens in a family scripture study the kind of norms of that discourse community and that reading experience are different than the reading experience of historians. This is a historian going through archives, kind of skimming the contents probably of every box to see where, just searching for some unique find. And so the rules are different in those things. And what I'm talking about today is how do we teach students to feel more comfortable in this discourse community. So discourse communities, reading within a discourse community they have different purposes. Why do historians read? It's different than why you read in a family setting, reading the scriptures, or different than why you would sit at home and read a novel. And so we want to try to invite them into that discourse community. The texts are different, and when I say texts, I want you to think about that defined very broadly. So historians use a lot of written records, but in other fields it might be artifacts or it might be a city, like we heard in the last section. They pay attention to different things, they find significance in different things, they use different kinds of strategies to make sense of what they're looking at, or use different heuristics, which are like strategies that are used more flexibly. They communicate about text in different ways. So think a little bit about your discipline and what are the purposes for reading the text and so on. There's one other kind of background principle that I want to talk about, and that's this idea of epistemic stance. And so there are epistemic cultures, and the idea of that is that different groups favor different methods of acquiring knowledge. So when you're at church, when somebody says, I know something, the way they know is different than if you're at a skate park and somebody says, hey, I know how to do this, or if you're at home, or if you're a historian. When you say, I know, you gather that information, you build knowledge in different ways. And so what I found is that unless students understand the epistemology of your discourse or discipline, they're not likely to be able to read. If you give them the text of your discipline without helping them understand the epistemology of your discipline, they get frustrated. At least this is the experience in history. I'll give you some examples in a second. So one of the first things you have to do, just like a missionary meeting investigators for the first time, and they say, let me tell you how you can know that what we're teaching is true. And it's a different way of knowing. And a lot of times they have to create this new epistemic stance among their investigators. And we have to do the same thing with our students if we're going to try to get them to read like a historian. Most students, their epistemic stance typically coming from secondary schools is kind of like this. This is the student, this is the teacher. How do I learn something? How do I build knowledge? It's by listening or reading the textbook and trying to remember. So they view building knowledge as remembering, understanding and remembering. And instead, I think as experts, when we look at our discipline, we see building knowledge more like this, as really constructing knowledge. And there are different kinds of rules and tools and resources that different people in different fields use, but it's definitely a different epistemic stance. So here's a little history example for you. There's been some research on young people's epistemic stance in history, and they found that they kind of go through these stages as they mature with instruction. So the early stage is this objectivist stage, and this is where they say history is the past. It's just what happened. How do I learn it? I just receive it from the textbook, receive it from a lecture, and accept it at face value. And there are even a lot of adults that still have this, like Rush Limbaugh. I don't know if you have heard his quotes about history, but he's got one that says, "You want to know what history is? It's simple. It's just what happened." He's still in the least mature of the epistemic stances when it comes to understanding history.
Not just a negative problem.
So this is what I do with my 201 class. I want to rattle them a little bit from this epistemic stance if they're still there. And so one of the very first days of class, I point out to them, here are some quotes from chapter 1 of your textbook. We are similarly uncertain about if these dates are correct. As far as we know, it's not easy to say. We have no idea beyond guesswork of the actual. This is an inexact science. These are all from chapter 1 We're still struggling to understand. These are big, perplexing problems because these facts have encouraged speculation that it's an intriguing speculation. Most of the evidence has been lost. We have too few sites for a complete, reliable picture. The question remains open. So as I'm rattling them, what I'm hoping is they'll at least move into this next stage, and usually the research shows this is kind of a short-lived stage, and they're just kind of transitory. But they might go through a time period where they say everyone's entitled to their own opinion of what happened. This is not really what historians do either. They're not their view, but at least now they understand history is interpretive. People are, can build different understandings. So then, once I've got them to that stage, then I try to move them into the criterial stage. And this is where historians are, and this is what we want. So these are slides that come right from my 201 class. So where does historical knowledge come from? So you've all probably eaten this, and you know that it comes from this. And you've all probably read something like this, but you probably don't know where it comes from, or you might not know where it comes from. So I want to take some time with the class and talk about where does history come from. And so we'll talk about these meta concepts. These are big overarching concepts of history. What is history? It's not the past. It's the study of the past. So history is to the past like science is to nature. They're different. Science is the study of nature. History is the study of the past. They're different things. What do historians do? What is historical evidence? I've done some fun stuff, research on what do historians do with younger kids. So I did a year-long study with 5th graders, and I asked them at the start of the year and the end of the year, what do historians do? And at the start of the year, the number 1 response I got was, I don't know. And then the number 2 responses were just all over the place. There wasn't really a second common response. They said, and I follow up with other questions like, they would say they write books, and I would say, well, how do they get information to put in the books? They watch the History Channel. But somewhere that's got to come from somewhere, So where do the people they get it for the History Channel get it? What is evidence? What counts for evidence? What role do inference and interpretation play? What is historical significance? The bottom line is, where does historical knowledge come from? So we take some time to talk about these kinds of themes at the start of the 201 class. Then finally, once they get to the criterialist stance, this is the idea that this is the epistemic stance of the criterialist. Evidence leads to defensible interpretations of what happened. So you're not entitled to whatever opinion you want on history. You've got to have evidence to back your opinion up, and that's you've got to be able to defend it with evidence. And so I'll talk to students and show them. Look, here's some examples of the kinds of evidence that historians draw from: archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, and anthropological evidence, scientific evidence, cultural evidence, written evidence, and especially written evidence. So writing is really what historians are most focused on. So what are the epistemic stances of your discipline? And how do geographers build knowledge? How do political scientists? Part of the challenge of teaching young people to think and read like an expert is that when you're an expert, you're so immersed in it and things are so automatic to you that sometimes you just kind of take it for granted, the ways of thinking, and so you almost have to take a step back away from your field a little bit and say, I thought the one comment was really insightful in the last one, is how does this feel for a person that's being exposed to it for the very first time? And it's hard to step out of our expertise and think about that. In history, much of the research has been done by psychologists outside of history that are interested in how historians think. And so it's nice to get an outsider's perspective on that. And I don't know of any research in geography, other social sciences, like there is in historical reading. But I'm interested in it, so if anyone want to collaborate on research part, you look at what experts do in your field. Okay, so Now, when we get into helping them read, I think the key thing is they've got to be exposed to the kinds of texts that experts in your field are exposed to. And textbooks are not the primary kind of text that historians are spending their time with. So we want to expose them to these kinds of things, the primary source documents, rather than just these kinds of things. And there's a place for this too, but when and this is to back up a little bit to epistemic stance, when I was an undergraduate student here, I took a World Civilizations course, and we got a textbook for the course, and we got a packet of primary source documents. And I remember going through the primary sources, and I'd read 3 or 4 pages of, some Buddhist writing or some writing, and then I would look at the textbook, and the textbook would summarize in 1 paragraph what I had to read 4 pages of this other text to get. And I remember being really frustrated with this primary source packet and thinking, why on earth is this professor making us look at this when we can get all the information right here from the textbook? And I remember very well having that attitude at the time. And now, and the problem was I didn't understand why those primary sources were so vital in history. So this might be if you're any political scientists. So a poll results might be the kind of, a text of yours. And a student who's literate, or a political scientist who's literate in this, would say, what about the question? It's a really, really bad survey question. They've got all these things to make it sound scientific, margin of error. So here's some stuff historians might use. These are texts. Propaganda, architecture, fashion, artifacts, music. Of all things perceptible to a historian, there's not one which he might not conceivably use as evidence on some question, if he came to it with the right question in mind. So the whole world is our, depending on what questions we're asking, the whole world is possibilities as evidence. So what are your thoughts now on your disciplines? What are the texts that are vital in your disciplines?
We always teach that the research documents are the primary, the peer-reviewed research study is the primary document. But even more prime than that, I suppose, is the actual hands-on of the study.
Yeah, maybe the data that comes out of the study, or
the observations that make up the study design.
What field are you in?
I teach research in the School of Family Life.
Okay. The others that...
I teach the clothing and textiles in School of Family Life, and we look at 20th century costume, and that's where I learned history, was looking at what people wore and why, and what was happening to society. And so I teach them to not just look at, here's what's the fashion of this century, of this decade, but why. And what were people doing, what were their families doing, what was their work, what wars, what. So I teach them to look at what people are wearing, what kind of clothing.
You want an interesting text, her brassiere would be a really interesting text. Because look how boyish, that's the idea in the 20s. You want to be boyish if you're a girl, and that's, Okay, so now let's talk about the reading strategies, the literacies that are associated with your discipline, and just think about those a little bit. And I want to do a little case study with a historical document. So, this is a transcription of this document. So read through it real fast, and then let's talk about what your questions are, what a historian might be thinking as they're looking at this.
So what's your question?
So what questions do you think a historian would, or how would a historian approach a primary source like this? What would they want to know? What would they ask about? What would they talk about? What are your thoughts?
Get to know who wrote it.
Okay, who wrote it? So this is number one for a historian, number one.
I would wanna know which general, which president, and I'm quite, impressed that the president or whoever wrote this would actually take the blame. So
Okay.
yeah, I think I'm liking this guy.
All right,
Well,
all
why
right,
would he do
good.
it? Why would he take the blame?
He
As a
said,
general.
he's taking the
I
blame.
know, he's doing it,
Yes,
but
but
why
why?
would he? Why wouldn't he
You
say
gotta know
this
the
is such and such
incentives.
guy, you know?
I don't know. Okay, these are good questions. So a lot of this has to do with context. But number one for a historian, they've got to know who the source of a text. And when I've worked with students before, we go over this over and over again, is when you get a document, the very first thing you have to do is find the source. And this is not instinctive to young students, is they'll read it, like I read that primary source packet, and not even consider at all who the source was. It's just information I'm getting, like I would read the textbook.
So, do anything with them about the legitimacy of the source?
Well, that's part of understanding the source, is what is the source's level of participation? Were they there? Were they an eyewitness? Did they write about it after? Did they have an axe to grind, or did they have something to gain by what they're saying in it? And so all those kinds of things come into play with looking at the source. The source of this is Eisenhower. He wrote it on June 5th, got the date wrong on it, which might be useful. And what happened June 5th in 44? This is D-Day, yeah, so he's talking about D-Day. So, I thought we won D-Day. Yeah, well, it was June 5th rather than July 5th, so he just
You wrote the wrong.
wrote the wrong date on it. Yeah,
Studies memory, it's like he was a whole month out.
yeah. But to the day, he just got the
Yeah,
month wrong
that's
about the day.
Started in June.
Yeah. A couple other things about it is he wrote this before the attack, and after he found, in case he had to issue a press release, he would have a statement that he could make to the press, and held on to it. And then when he found out the attack was successful, threw it in the garbage can. And one of his aides thought, hey, that might be a cool piece of evidence later on, and so pulled it out of the garbage can and salvaged it. And so, if we read this like students typically do, just searching for information, we find out that on July 5th, there was a failed attack on these places, and all that is wrong. But if we read it like a historian, knowing the source, paying attention to the context, then we can find out a lot about Eisenhower. You know, your questions about why would he take the responsibility, says something about his character. We learn about the nature of war and how they didn't know. When we look back on the past, we think that outcomes were inevitable, but before the battle, the outcome was definitely not viewed as, you know, an inevitable victory for the Allies. Anyway, so there's some things to learn, but it's only useful if you read it like a historian and go through some of those strategies. So 3 in particular, and again, this is a model for you to think about your discipline and just say, okay, what are the strategies that geographers, political scientists always use as they approach the texts that they use? And for historians, they always look at the source. They want to know who said it, did they say it, who was it written for, what was their purpose, what was their level of participation, and all those things. Historians are looking for corroboration. Do we have other evidence that confirms this? How do different perspectives agree or disagree with what Eisenhower said? And then they look at the context. They want to know about the physical location, but also the social context, the values of the time, the linguistical context, because language is always changing over time. Sometimes words have different meanings now than they did then. So your challenge then, to be able to teach students to read like geographer or political scientists, is to try to analyze how do experts read. And again, because it's so automatic for so many of us, that sometimes it's hard to put our finger on the strategies that they use. So any other thoughts or questions?
Could you remind me what the main header for the last couple of minutes that you were talking about was?
We're talking about disciplinary strategies, or disciplinary literacies.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Or we talked about cognitive apprenticeships for a few minutes. So to me, this is a really important idea about teaching. So when students come into your class, this green circle represents what a student can do. And that's what they can do already before they come into your class. And so if the reading assignments that you give are things that they can already do as they come into your class, then they're not really learning. It's just what they can already do. They're not really building literacies. They can already read like that. The purple, you have to help them. Yeah. So you have to set up an assignment that pushes them beyond what they can do by themselves, and then you have to help them. And so, and then what happens is after you help them, and maybe a time or two, then you withdraw your help from them, and what has happened? That green circle has expanded a little bit, and they've learned, and they can do more things now without your help than they could do before, and they've learned. So this is I think a great little model of learning, and social learning especially. Okay, so this, I know this is blurry and I'll read the important parts of it, but I really like the way that it's laid out. So this is a model of teaching that's called the gradual release of responsibility. And the idea with this model is that early in the interaction, the teacher's support for the students is really high. In fact, the teachers are doing most of the work and the students are watching the teacher's work. So I do, you watch. It's kind of at the start. And then as time goes on, the teacher starts to turn some of the responsibility over to students. This is where I do and you help. And then gradually, the students take on more of the responsibility, and that's where you have this you do and I help idea. And then finally, the teacher kind of steps back altogether unless the students work on their own. This is the you do, I watch idea. And so gradually, you may start with demonstrations, and then you have shared demonstrations, and then you have guided practice and then independent practice, and then it's a process where you can turn the literate acts over to the students. So I've seen a lot of times a professor will put up a primary source document and then we'll explain to the class what this means and then move on to the next PowerPoint slide. And that's great at this stage, but eventually you want to push the students on to where they're reading the documents and not just watching the professor read the documents. You know what I'm saying? This, we also see this a lot in the church, I think, and with parents. There's great research on these different models of instruction. One of the most interesting studies on this is that mothers, they've done research on moms working with little children, and moms have this instinct, almost a perfect instinct about the rate at which to withdraw support, scaffolding, and as the students start to pick things up. And dads don't. Dads are like, come on, you can do it! And moms just know how to support and how to, not all, that's generally speaking, but they found that moms are a lot better at withdrawing scaffolding at an appropriate rate than dads are. All right, any other thoughts or reactions to this model?
Girls rule.
Boys rule.
So as you were showing this, I was thinking about Joyce Adams giving me counsel about students writing papers, and how you shouldn't just have a student hand in a paper at the end and expect them to know what to do. And so if you can make it incremental and show them how to do certain things as you go along, and then, gradually you thrive, then I think that's an example of maybe of that.
Yeah. I think a couple of ways you can think about this is over the course of a program, from start to finish, you could see this happening with students where, in early level classes, they're doing more observing. By the time they're in the methods class of the discipline, they're doing more of the work themselves. But I think even within a class, one semester long class, you can do this to some extent. So with my 201 class, I require, this is a large 150 student class some semesters, and I would require 2 papers in the semester because that's about all that I could handle giving feedback on and final grades. And so the first paper would probably be somewhere around in here, this level, where I had students read Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is an amateur historian made interpretations about historical events based on evidence, and he writes very carefully in this book what his evidence is based on. And he makes some kind of out there interpretations that allow for easy criticism. And so I have the students write a book review on what this historian has done, using evidence to come up with interpretations and then defend those interpretations in writing. That's what historical, really the best historical writing is. And then later in the semester, the second paper, I have students, I give them about 8 or 9 documents related to the Crusades, and then I have them look through those documents looking for patterns, and then come up with some kind of an interpretation of the Crusades based on what the evidence has said, an original research paper, based on this interpretation that they've come up with. So in that second round, they're trying to do what they watched Jared Diamond do in the first paper, where so the first paper gives them a chance to read what a historian has done, and then the second paper gives them a chance in a really simplified environment. I give them the documents, and there's only a few documents, and they come up with an interpretation and have to defend it. I do better at this in my methods of teaching classes. So at the start of some of the classes, we're in the classroom, and I'm doing, here's a lesson I would use with high school kids. And then later on, they're in the class saying, here's a lesson we could use, and I would help them tweak it. And by the end of that class, we're out in the schools together, and they're teaching lessons, and I'm watching them teach high school kids, and then we talk about them after we do debriefing. All right, any other thoughts about this? Susie?
Usually I don't talk this much. But I think we can also apply that with training students to do research too. I think it's a really good model for how to actually do it and let them want to, and then gradually they'll.
Yeah. But this idea of cognitive apprenticeship is not just for your research assistant. That's for your whole class. But it definitely works well when you really have an apprentice. One apprentice is right there by your side. But the idea is we want to stretch that to the whole class as well, and so it's a little different idea of an apprenticeship. I like the thought. Okay, so explicit strategy instruction is one way that you can provide more support for students. And explicit strategy instruction is there's 4 steps. You give direct instruction, you model, guided practice, independent practice. So the direct instruction part, this is where, let's say I want to talk about sourcing today in my class, and I'm really going to hit it hard. So I would say, class, today we're going to talk about a strategy that historians use that's called sourcing. Every time they get a document, one of the first things they do, or the first thing they do, is they look at the source. And so I've talked about, I've given it a title, sourcing. And it's nice to do that because then when they turn in a research paper, in the margins you can write nice sourcing, and you've got a common word for the strategy that you can use. Historians don't typically use sourcing. That's a word that they don't use that word. They use the strategy, but they don't know what it's called. Psychologists came up with a word for it to make it convenient to teach the kids. So you're talking about what it is, why use sourcing. You can't comprehend this document fully unless you use sourcing. It makes a difference who says something and their level of participation, because we can't just take everybody's word for it. I'll just give you this example too. One other way I introduce the idea of an epistemic stance and sourcing and all these things with younger kids is I'll give this scenario. I'll say, let's say that there was a fight in the cafeteria, and the principal wanted to get to the bottom of what had happened. The principal could take written statements from a number of people and then go through those written statements to try to figure out what happened. And I'd say, would the principal be interested in getting a written statement from the 2 kids that fought? And the answer is probably yes. Would the principal trust everything that those kids said in those statements? No. Would those 2 statements be identical? No, probably not. And then we can talk about, well, would the principal want to get a statement from the parents of the kids that fought? They weren't even there. But they do maybe know long-term, problems that were going on between these 2 kids. So they might have something that would, and you could take some time and go through all kinds of different How about cafeteria workers that were there? How about kids that were there in the cafeteria that were too far away to hear what was happening, but they could see what was happening? And so that way you can kind of set kids up and say, the historian is doing the same thing, basically, except the stuff that they're studying happened 100 years ago instead of 2 days ago. And they're using written evidence, and that written evidence is contradictory sometimes, it's fragmentary, and I talk about sourcing then with that analogy. Then the second part is modeling or externalization. It's where you take what's going on up here and you lay it out there for the students to see. So you might say something like this: all right, today we're going to do a document-based activity, and the very first document we're going to analyze, I want to do that together. So, you put the document up and everybody's looking at it and you say, what's the first thing we do as we start in on this document? We look at the source, right, sourcing. And when I did this with my high school kids, they would roll their eyes. We look at the source, because they heard it so many times, but I just want to ingrain them. That's just automatic. You don't even have to think about it anymore. Just automatically go to the source. And then we work through the document together. And after we've looked at the source, we might say, okay, so now I've read the source. Who cares what the guy's name is? What's more important? That this was a British officer, and he wrote in his diary, and he wrote it the day of the battle, rather than months later. So we look at all those kinds of aspects of the source. And who was he writing to? In a journal, there's a certain audience. If he's making a sworn deposition, it's a different audience. So we look at all those kinds of things. Another way of modeling is when a student throws out something, gives an answer in class, I'll always ask, how did you figure that out? And why do I ask that? That's right, it's externalization. Something good happened in this boy's mind, and I want them to show what that was so that the kids that couldn't figure it out have an idea about the process that they used. Because that's the whole idea, is we want to think aloud for students, and we want to model the process and not just the product. Because students, they are exposed to good products all around them all the time. But what's the mystery for those that struggle maybe a little more is the process of how you get to a good product. And so modeling is all about externalizing, making visible the hidden processes that are going on in the minds of good thinkers. And you're a good thinker. You're an expert in your discipline. So you got to make what's going on in your head visible to students. Then the third stage is guided practice. And guided practice involves providing some kind of scaffolding or support for students that you can withdraw over time. That's what makes it scaffolding, because it's temporary. No building would ever be built with the scaffolding permanently around it. You got to remove it, as the kids can do it on their own. You can give simplified tasks. You can give partially completed tasks. You can give graphic organizers. You think about historical reading, and this is a sophisticated, and I'm sure in your field it's just as sophisticated, but we're asking students to read sometimes difficult texts and comprehend difficult texts, and maybe to read 4 or 8 difficult texts, and then to look for similarities and differences within those texts, and then come up with some kind of conclusion based on the similarities and differences while keeping in mind the context of the time period. I mean, that's asking a lot of their limited working memory. And so things like graphic organizers that give them a place to write an analysis of one of the texts before moving on to the next one, whatever you can do to simplify the task for students is really vital at this point. Group work is a way to simplify. And then finally, the fourth step is independent practice. And this is very useful because it gives students a chance to assess themselves, and for an instructor to assess them and see whether they got it or need more instruction, and to give feedback. So sometimes they're working in a supported environment and they think, oh, I got this down pat. And then they go out and try to do it on their own and they realize, this isn't as easy as I thought it was. And so that kind of a self-assessment can help them come back with questions and get more support. Okay. So we've got 7 minutes left, and I've got an example of a historical literacy lesson. So, do you have any questions before we get into this little example? I think you'll have fun with it, but it's not very important. So if you have other questions, let's hear.
So Jeff, do you kind of repeat this process each class period then? I mean, is this how you structure your lecture notes?
Not necessarily. So, I might hit direct instruction heavy the first time we're doing a document-based activity, or I might do explicit instruction or direct instruction on a different strategy on a couple different times. So I might focus on sourcing one time and then focus more on corroboration another class. But this is actually a really tedious way to teach. It's not that entertaining, and it can be just a little tedious. And so there's also something called implicit strategy instruction. And this is where you design activities that have students use the strategies without talking explicitly about the strategies. And so I'll mix in some implicit with explicit. So just because this becomes a little too tedious if you're doing it too much. And there's some kids that get it right away, and then it's really tedious for them because they're like, oh, can I just work ahead? I already know how to do this, and why are we talking about this again? We've already talked about it. You get what I mean?
Yeah, so then how do you structure your lecture notes? I'm just trying to, I wrote a note down, but then I realized maybe you don't want your lecture structured this way.
Yeah, definitely I wouldn't. So I think a good way to structure a document-based lesson, and I'm not saying that you should teach the literacies every day, but you should teach them sometimes. So a good way to structure it is to have a content lecture where you're giving background information. And the purpose of the background information is not necessarily just to give them more information, but it's to give them the background they need so they can work wisely with the text that you're going to be giving them later. So here's some background. We're going to do some work on the Boston Massacre today. Before we get into these documents, there's a couple things you need to know. And these are things that historians almost universally agree on. So here's what's not controversial about the Boston Massacre. Almost every historian agrees this, and this. And I might take 10 minutes to get that background. Now, what they disagree on was whether Captain Preston was guilty of manslaughter or not. And we're going to look at some documents to try to get to the bottom of that. So you start with a lecture or a mini lecture, then you can move into a document-based activity, and then you end up with a class debriefing where you can ask questions like, okay, you looked at 8 documents, which one would you rank number 1 on reliability? And you let the students, and that's where they can talk about sourcing and those kinds of things. So it's actually a really good way to structure a lesson because you've got some whole class work where you're talking to the whole class. You've got some small group work, maybe where they're working on documents together, and then you've got some whole class discussion at the end where you're kind of digesting what happened during their small group work.
So I tried something like, what I think it's actually scaffolding, although I didn't know that's what I was doing. So in my upper division classes, we read documents, and then we would have, over the course of the semester, there were 8 days that we would take to talk about the documents. That's all we would do that class period. And so the first 4, I would give them discussion questions. And then the last 4, I put them into groups and said, you guys have to come up with your own discussion questions, right? Their questions were still bad. So where did I go wrong?
So maybe what you could have done, did you give them explicit instruction on how to come up with a good discussion question? So you modeled it, but maybe just a little bit of...
I skipped a step.
Yeah, maybe. So you gave it to them, like here are some good questions, but maybe just talking about what makes these good questions might help. I don't know. And then the other thing with this is it just requires a lot of patience. So this is not the work of one history professor in one history class, but it really has to be across the department where they're getting these lessons on literacy again and again and again.
Well, I just feel like I have a hard time knowing when to take back the scaffolding. And I also worry that we are going to end up with a lot of students that are like buildings that the scaffolding never came down. You know?
Yeah.
Like what? Are they going to get? I feel like that's what happened there. They just got used to it. They got used to me giving them the questions, and so then they're like, they didn't really think about it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a question in there or just a frustration.
No, that actually is a really good point. Is that different students' zone of proximal development is different. Like you've got a class full of kids, and some of them have this big they can do it by themselves, and you've got others that's this big they can do by themselves, and so trying to set up activities that are within that zone of proximal development. And you think it's tough here at BYU, where the entrance standards are so high, you know, the ZPDs are fairly close here, but in public schools, teaching about something requires greater knowledge of it than just trying to learn about something. And so they kind of, when they get into groups, they'll kind of, a lot of times, self-select their roles within that group, and the ones that get it better do what they need, which is teaching it, and the ones that get it, that aren't as strong, will do what they need to do, and they'll learn it. I've got one other thing I'll tell you in a second, but should I answer that question first?
I was just gonna say, Joe mentioned think, pair, share, which can be an effective strategy for helping if you can pair the students up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, ideally, you could choose the groups and say, okay, I want these 4 together. I mean, this is more what public school teachers would do, but if you knew the ability level of the students within your class, you could group them up so that some of the stronger ones could help some of the ones that are really lower. One other thing that sometimes I'll do is I'll intentionally word an assignment to set it up so that it's a little bit vague, so that the product, there will be like a range of products that I expect. And then as I work with individuals, I can say, this is kind of what I expect the project to be. And so for example, I'll say, I want you to come up with a thesis. This is for the Crusades paper. You gotta have a thesis. The best theses are analytical, interpretive kinds of theses. The less strong theses are descriptive kinds of theses, where you're just writing more of a report. And I'll let them choose which they want to take on, but I'll let them know that the stronger essays are going to be the ones that choose an analytical thesis. And so that way they're kind of self-selecting where they're going that way. So there's a couple, but that, to me, the zone of proximal development question is the toughest question of teaching when you're teaching a large group, is how do you accommodate every student with their individual needs? Great question, and there isn't an easy answer to it. Any other questions? Let me take 30 seconds and show you this lesson, just so you get an idea. So we won't do it, I'll just show you. So I take a second and ask students, what do you see here? And they almost always say slaves. Then I say, there isn't a slave in this picture. This picture was taken after slavery was illegal. So then I come up with a question for them. This is me kind of scaffolding historical thinking. Why did freedmen, which is the name of former slaves, continue to work and live as they had as slaves after they were free? And I've created that question. And that's the kind of question historians would ask and have asked through the years. And then I give them 3 theories. The slaves were loyal to their masters. The slaves were tricked or forced or abused into staying, or they didn't have the resources to leave. And so this, again, a real historian would have to come up with these interpretations themselves, and I've narrowed it down to 3 possibilities to try to provide some scaffolding. And then I give them evidence, and we look at letter written by a Ku Klux Klansman, we look at contracts, sharecropping contracts, we look at testimony of former slaves testifying later about how they were treated. This is my favorite, and this kind of throws a wrench in their whole plan. This woman, it talks about how the slaves didn't want to leave when the Union Army came and was trying to free them. They cried and begged her that they could stay on her plantation. And you got to look at the source and think about what's going on at the time. And this, I like to give students conflicting evidence, so they have to. It's that this equilibrium that we were just barely hearing about. And then I raise the screen. We got the whiteboard, and they can come plot where they are on this chart, between the 3 theories, so you got dots all over, and then I'll have them talk about it. Who's this? Who's clear over here? Let's hear which document did you find most compelling? And those kinds of things. So that's it. So I know I haven't given you much for your discipline, but hopefully I've given you some things to think about, and you can find some applications for your discipline.